it's a great pleasure to have all of you here, ERC awardees, and I'm very curious about your experiences with the ERC and what you've done before, what you're doing now, what's the future looking like. So, given that we know each other a little bit, I'm really excited about this. Ari, since you said you were the first ERC from Southeast Asia, you had a very different experience of the whole process. Why don't you tell us something about that experience? What did you do once you got the ERC? You know, how did it change your life, I guess?
Well, it didn't quite change my life, but it kind of changed my career trajectory. I think I was an associate professor when I got it as a consolidated grant in 2014. That was the stage where the ERC was splitting the starter and the consolidator. I think that was the year they split. So I kind of straddled both. So then as soon as I got that, I established one of the centers here in Durham. So I became like the director of the Center for Crop Improvement Technology that works with a lot of industry and a lot of the CGIR centers. These are the development institutes that work on agriculture for developing countries. So we work with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we work with UKRI, we work with the different foundations that do this kind of stuff. So that kind of took off. And then very soon after that, I became a professor after that. And then I established kind of this new kind of science in plant biology called protein modification using SUMO. It's small ubiquitin-like modifier. This is the thing that changes signaling within the cells to allow plants to adapt to the environment. So at the moment, out of that ERC grant, then I got the Frontier Bioscience grant from the UKRI government. And that was last year, I got that. And that was one, they only gave out 4 that year. And the only one that was given to plants was from our lab. And that's 4.5 million over 5 years. So that was one of these elite Frontier Bioscience programs. So it's really fantastic. I even wrote to, is it SG Network or something like that? I don't know what that is, but to tell them about it, because I think, because it's got so much development, you know, working with poor farmers to develop. We work so much with China, with India to develop the technology with them. So I have lots of networks, and the ERC really allowed me to be able to do that, to work with, you know, Beijing, I work with Delhi. Now I can't go anywhere, but most of the time I'm flying to these places. So that really changed my outlook. So I changed my lab from the ERC, with the ERC grant, I changed my lab from working on fundamental system in models to crops in development. And that was a really conscious decision, because I come from Singapore, where I never seen a field before of wheat or rice, you know. Now half my lab is in Vietnam, in the Mekong, growing kind of rice, working with rice, and then the other half in South America, Rio Grande do Sul, also working on rice, which like completely changed my perception of what is it that you want to do as a scientist. Yeah. And now my aim is, hopefully, that we can see one variety of rice growing in a field somewhere that came from our lab.
I'm from the Philippines.
And then I think I can retire.
Thanks. Dr. Hsiang, you are based in Norway. How did you end up there?
Well, by accident, I guess, some kind of accident. So I did my PhD at the University of Chicago. And when I finished, I'd spent 6 years there, and it felt like time to move on and to move a little closer to home, which is Singapore. So Europe seemed like a good place, and it just happened to be a position for a postdoc at that point, and so I moved to Norway.
And you stayed, and the ERC that you got, it's still with the same institution, so you've stayed in the same place?
Yes, so that's a little unusual when it comes to, postdocs and moving around the world. So once I started my first postdoc, it was such a great department where I was. It's called the Center for Ecological and Evolutionary Synthesis at the University of Oslo, and it's one of these national centers of excellence. It was a great place, really stimulating and very supportive. But I was on soft money for a long time, and but I really didn't want to leave Oslo because it was such a great place for work-life balance. I got to do whatever I wanted to do research-wise, and I had a life outside of research, which is great for the research because you need to be able to think freely and not be stressed out, to be creative. So what the ERC has allowed me to do, strangely enough, everything happened at the same time, right? So I applied for a job in Oslo that was completely disconnected from what I was doing. But at the same time, I applied for an ERC grant, and I got both of them like back to back. So everything happened at the same time. And then with my grant, I stayed at more or less the same institute, but I'm getting to do something that is quite the same, but at the same time very different, because the ERC grant is allowing me to be really brave. I couldn't be brave when I was postdoc, and I made the first part of my career out of analyzing data that already existed in databases. But I felt really dissatisfied because the data didn't suit my purposes. But the ERC has allowed me now to collect my own data, which is hard work, but it's going to be totally worth it.
And the ERC is still ongoing, or yeah? Nicholas. Oh, great. Speaking of work-life balance, Nicholas, you are in the Netherlands. Seems like quite known for work-life balance as well. Was that a conscious choice for you as well, or how do you end up in where you are at the moment?
Yeah, so I first came to the Netherlands as a postdoc, right? So I was finishing my PhD, and I went to a postdoc position. I got offered a postdoc position in Amsterdam in a biophysics institute. So I went there not really knowing much about the work-life balance thing, because, it was not a big thing back then, at least for me. So I just went for it, sort of try to see what life in Amsterdam offered. So that's what I did, and I experienced it's actually a very nice life in the sense of, the science is great. There's amazing infrastructure. There's amazing density of research, density of science in such a small country. The Netherlands is a small country. It's still large in comparison to Singapore, for example, but still it's by European standard is small. Yet the density of science, the density of research is amazingly high. So that's what I like a lot about the Netherlands. And at the same time, it's, as what you said already, there's an amazing balance between work and life. So people here really respect your private life. There's a clear separation between what is regarded as work and what is regarded as private life, and people actually respect that. And that's so there was a conscious decision once I was there in Amsterdam to stay on in the Netherlands. And one of the reasons why I decided to take up an assistant professorship in Eindhoven, which is, it's not that far away from Amsterdam. It's like 1.5 hours driving or by train. It's a bit less metropolitan than Amsterdam, but it's still very international in the sense of, there's so many people from all around the world in this small city. But at the same time, the city itself is small in the sense of, I can just let my kids roam around the streets. They can just play outside in the streets, and I don't have to worry about them being hit by a car or something. So there's a nice balance in that sense.
Kevin, you moved around as well, no? Before you ended up in Switzerland. Can you tell us a little bit about the process, how you ended up where you are, and I guess also you know, what was your experience with the ERC?
I would say if I look back 20 years in the past, I would have never predicted where the journey and where I landed up. It was just completely not predictable. I had a well-defined plan to go back to Singapore and so on. And all of that went away because when I was in Colorado, I met my future wife, who is from Germany. And somewhere along the way, you know, after a decade in the US, I had understood American culture enough that I felt American. You know, I felt that I could get a green card as the next step. I understood their culture and their jokes and so on. But somehow I couldn't see myself raising my kids there. Just couldn't see it. I had fundamental disagreements. I have great respect for the American education, the higher education system. I think there are many things they do right and some things they do wrong, just like all other countries. But for very personal reasons, my wife and I just wanted to raise our kids European. So we tried very hard to come to Europe for that reason. I had offers in the US I actually turned down opportunities in like Berkeley and Caltech to actually go to ETH, and some of my friends told me, you're crazy. You know, why would you do that? And then the other part maybe to tell you is that when I was at ETH, it was not clear that I would get a faculty position at Bern. In fact, towards the end of my fellowship at ETH, I was looking at other types of jobs. I was partially resigned to quitting academia. So I think the only constant in academia is that you just cannot bet on anything, right? And right now, as I mentioned to you during the informal chat, I'm in the privileged position that I'm considering I've been offered the first chair professorship in exoplanet science in the history of Germany. And I'm considering it. It's a great opportunity. But again, if you asked me 20 years ago if this would happen, I would say, no way. You know, the odds are like 1 in a million. As to what the ERC has done for me, I think it has done many things. At least in my field, I imagine it's the same in your field, it's a badge of honor, right? It's sort of like a club. If you get this badge of honor, it opens doors for you. When you speak, people listen a little bit closer and so on. It shouldn't be that way, but it is, right? And the other thing it did for me that is more substantial is that it allowed me to hire 3 very talented postdocs on long-term contracts. So I gave them 4-year contracts each, one of them 5 years. So I hired a very talented theoretical astrophysicist in France who has since gone back to Paris on a permanent position. I hired an extremely talented researcher from India who was educated at Amsterdam, who is half a geologist and half an astrophysicist, very rare. And I hired a very talented American guy, Russell, who is half an astrophysicist and half an astrobiologist. And I think these 3 postdocs really transform, as one of you said, the dynamic of my group. It really, the group went from like, it went from a group that was kind of typical to basically the biggest group in exoplanet science in Europe, right? At one point we had 7 postdocs and 5 PhD students, which is insane. And it was very much a postdoc driven group. The postdocs were setting the tone, setting the example. And out of that, some of the postdocs did really, really well. And in fact, 3 of my postdocs ended up with professorships or permanent positions, which is, I find, quite remarkable in the short history of my group, which is about 8 years so far. So I'll stop there. I mean, there's more to say, but I don't want to take up.
No. I'm curious because all of us said something about, you know, the project not fitting into one discipline and interdiscipline, you know, crisscrossing, mixing together some insights from different disciplines. So I thought might be a good, I mean, what was, because for national funding agencies, that's really hard to pull off as well, right? Like people want to see a project embedded, it's going to be an excellent project embedded in a particular discipline. At least in the social sciences, we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity, but actually in reality, it's really hard to pull off something that's acceptable to different disciplines. So I wonder what did you think about when you were applying and as you were going through the process as well of building the ERC project as you're going through the project, how important was this for you?
You're asking me or
Okay.
asking in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a general question. Dr. Hsiang, maybe you can start and then we'll get it from there.
So yeah, I'd love to start. So one of the things that hit me, of course, when you apply, when you start applying for ERC grant, you have to figure out which panel to go on.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit of a struggle because I didn't know which panel to go for. I could have gone for physical sciences one in geology because I'm a paleontologist, or I could go for one in biology, right? So that's the first thing. And what I really wanted to do was to draw together fields that have been disparate for a long time. I mean, we're supposed to be working on the same thing, right? Biologists and paleontologists, we all study life. And we all need statistical modeling to understand what we're looking at because we deal with a lot of data and a lot of complex processes. But again, there isn't that much tradition, for example, in paleontology to deal with a lot of complex data and complex models. So I was trying to pull a few things together. And at the same time, I was struggling to convince people to work on a group that nobody works on, a group of organisms that is, and I'll bet lots of money that none of you have heard of it. But they're a great model system, and I really wanted to bring them to the forefront in biology. So it was a real struggle in that sense, because I knew that I had a lot of people who thought very differently about things to be all on board with me on this. And that was a real challenge, but it was really fun to think about.
What about you, Dr. Ari?
I think it allows you to take risk, right? So, and it's frontier kind of science. So this is something I guess national agencies are thinking. I mean, the UK has always supports science that take risk more than, in my experience, more than most European countries. Because if you don't have risk, I had some of my grants turned down because it wasn't risky enough, right? So it's got a tendency to support risky stuff, but the interdisciplinary risk is harder to gauge.
Yeah.
So where you can go wrong and how many things they can go wrong, and the ERC can allow you to do that. So I think that's been really good, and I'm sure there are ERC grants where nothing has worked after 4 years, right? But that's the price I guess you pay for the leap that you make with some of the projects we talked about today, and I think that's always been the way science has worked, I think.
Kevin.
I actually fully agree with what Ari said. And I think most of the time agencies are too short-sighted. They want these short-term returns, like X goes in, Y goes out, and I can write Z down on the report, right? And a lot of the breakthroughs are not done this way. I came into interdisciplinary research in a very different route. In 2016, 1 year after I was tenured, I was suddenly given the reins of the center. And my job was, half my job was to make sure that people who usually don't talk to each other. So suddenly I had to make biochemists and planetary scientists and astrophysicists and philosophers of science talk to each other. And so this was really half my job, and I did it for 3-4 days a week. And boy, the number of failures we have had, as Ari was implying, was tremendous. I mean, there were some things that we failed so miserably that it was funny. But there were some successes that came out that we couldn't have anticipated if we didn't just try something completely out of the blue, right? So for example, I'll give you the most surprising example. There's a researcher in my center, assistant professor, who is trying to put something called a polarimeter on the International Space Station. His science goal is to use a technique called polarimetry to do remote scanning of biology. So for example, he could tell you if this was a field of grass or if this was a field of like dead leaves, right? He could tell you that. And what we didn't anticipate was that this very same technology can be used for non-invasive scanning of brain cancer. And in fact, the current state of the art of scanning for tumors is you cut a hole in the person's head, you take out some tissue, you ask that person to wait 30 minutes, right? 30 agonizing minutes, and then you test for it, right? And now this goes from that to essentially a scan in 2 minutes which is completely non-invasive. And we could not have anticipated that. And I think I gave you the example because that's the spirit of interdisciplinary research. You have to be able to do things that you sometimes cannot justify on paper. And to a great extent, the ERC allows you to do that because of course you have to write concrete things on the ERC grant. What I love about the ERC is the flexibility, right? If you tell them, look, I've made this discovery, I've made this innovation, and I would like to switch a bit my direction. My impression is that this is allowed, which is quite unusual.
Do you think because now I'm thinking about PhD students, usually you don't want to take risks as a PhD student. But if you're working for an ERC project, do you think that changes something about the way they think and the way they approach their research? Or what was your experience? Because you...
I have a very different answer for PhD students. This is completely my perspective, and you should ask the other people on the call. I think PhD students should not do interdisciplinary research because I believe that, at least in my field, you have to first be a black belt in something. You have to prove that you have mastered a certain niche, that you can publish, that you have a track record of 5 to 10 papers, you can give talks, you can do all the basic things. Then when you're a postdoc or later, you can do these more exploratory things. So I usually give advice that's the balance between what I tell you and more practical thing, I would say. Because the worst thing you can do in interdisciplinary research, and we should talk about that, is that you fall in between the cracks of two fields where you are not recognized by either field and you can't really publish in either field, and that's the worst.
Do you have a different point of view there? Nicholas, maybe?
Yeah, this is a tough one actually, because so when I did my PhD, so it's kind of a personal experience. I specifically looked for a project that was interdisciplinary, and maybe a bit by accident. So at the moment when I was looking for a PhD in NUS, they built a new program, which is still existing now. It's called NUS Graduate School for Integrative Sciences and Engineering. A long name, but it's basically a program specifically defined for PhD projects that are interdisciplinary. So in principle, when I was doing my PhD, I did not belong to any department. So my main supervisor was he was based in chemical and biomolecular engineering. My second supervisor, with whom I'm also working very closely, was from bioengineering. Had also a kind of informal third supervisor from physics. So, and I enjoyed it. So it gave me tremendous joy to actually work on a PhD, which, when I was talking to my fellow PhD students at that time, some of the students, the experience, the stories, like so they were struggling horrendously with their projects. They got bored with certain projects because they look at the same thing over and over and over again for 4 years. I did not have that experience at all, because it was, one day I was looking at one thing and I was discussing that thing with one supervisor. The next day I was discussing the same thing with a different pair of eyes, essentially, with another supervisor, and I enjoyed it. So it gave me the flexibility to, not be bound by a certain perspective and a certain way of looking at things, but to truly circle around the project, circle around the scientific problem from many different perspectives. And that's what I'm trying to actually do in my group now. So with my ERC grant now, I'm actually specifically hiring people of different backgrounds to study basically essentially the same system. So I have one a PhD student who is very, very good in chemistry, one PhD student who is coming from mechanical engineering background, so mechanical modeling of biological system. And that's what she's doing now, but previously she was purely mechanics. I have another PhD student coming from completely different things, so biotechnology. And I think it is actually the synergy between these perspectives that make ERC projects so potentially strong, right? So you can really, as I said before, you're not bound by a certain way of looking at things, but it gives you the ability to take the project, take the same system to many different routes.
Yeah, no, I agree with Nick there and Kevin as well. Well, one thing we shouldn't forget, I think, is the way I look at disciplinary or interdisciplinary research is kind of concentric circles. Like you have the core science people work on their discipline and push the boundaries of their discipline, in really the most fundamental. And then you have another circle around it, which is people who understand how to use their fundamental knowledge into application, right? And then you have the third concentric circles where they understand the real world problems, which we then connect with the translation. So for example, if, give you an example about, if we want to breed rice crops which can withstand flooding for more than 12 days, that's the biggest discovery in agri-tech in the last 30 years of rice plants which are submergence tolerant. And that has saved millions of lives all over Asia in rice production. Now, if we didn't understand how the fundamentals of how that gene worked, or that thing, you could never be able to use it in a mega variety that allows production to occur. So what ERC can do really well is that it doesn't forget the fundamental. Like if you're a physicist, what is the fifth element, or what is the next force, like something like that. You should never forget that fundamental aspect, but also how you may be able to translate that to real world, like what Kevin was talking about, this translation into using different technologies for different things. So something that you might learn in the fossils, I was just looking at Hsiang Liow, but it's really important to understand the fundamentals of that, so that somebody else in your team might be able to use that in a different way. So like coming up with a new natural law, right? Then how we can use that new natural law to push onto something that we never knew we could do. I think it takes a kind of a really unique individual to be able to see that big picture, to support that core team of boffins, like nerds like me, right? Complete nerds who just want to know how proteins work, And then from there, you have a team where you can actually take that to the field and put it in the hand of the farmer, who will actually can improve his yield. That means instead of only sending one of his 3 children to school, he can send all 3 children to school. Like to be able to see all of that, right? So it's kind of really important. I think we shouldn't forget that. I mean, I'm just throwing that in as a conversation point.
Yeah, no, it's also because I'm a social scientist by training, so I'm really interested in the way you see the interdisciplinary, because that's a slightly different conversation in my field. But yeah, Dr. Hsiang, because you're working on your ERC now, I guess my sort of just as a wrap-up question to all of us, but I'll start with you. What would be your advice to, so most of us, we always give advice to people who are applying for the ERC, right? So because now I'm at the stage in my ERC where I'm hiring people, and I feel like there's less discussion around when people apply for ERC projects, what should we be thinking about when we're hiring people, and also when postdocs are applying to the positions that we're offering? What would be your advice on, because some people, maybe they don't, the ERC is a little bit far, but postdoc applications, PhD applications, I think that's the kind of audience that we have for this conversation.
So I guess I would think that, I think a lot of my junior colleagues think that the ERC is a really far off thing. It's this big thing that they will not be successful at, and therefore why bother? But what I often tell a lot of my colleagues, and because we all work on the really basic nerdy science, we don't do that much application, and therefore it's really hard to get national funding because we don't do applied science. So what I tell them is that, it's great to think about fundamental research and core questions. And if you want to do something that is not applied, your best chance is the ERC. And think big, don't be afraid. And even if you fail, the thinking process and even the writing of the grant process is a great way to think and expand your creativity around your field and related fields and, greater interdisciplinarity. So that's what I tell my colleagues. And, I don't think people should feel like, oh, it's too grand, I shouldn't apply for it. It's just great to think about what might be possible, even if you don't end up putting in a proposal just because of, timing issues, whatever. But it's just something great to think about, is the what if question. What if I had 2 million euros? What would I do with it to move on with my research, right?
Yes. Kevin?
This is a big question. I think I'll answer the part that you asked about recruiting people. I think I agree. This is a very underrated part of our portfolio that is not talked about a lot. I would say the first rule is never recruit someone over just like Zoom or video chat. And I think that the qualities that we think when we go to school that we think make researchers successful, and the ones that actually make researchers successful are two completely different they're two different lists, right? For my list, I think a very underrated thing is it's less important that you are really book smart and you have good grades. Then you have some kind of grit, meaning that you will see something through and you will push it to its extreme conclusion, more so than the median of the population actually would. But this must be taken with a very strong caveat, because often when we think of grit, all kinds of implicit biases about men and women come in, right? So when you think of grit, you think of alpha male behavior, but that's not true. And in fact, it took me many years to understand how to recognize grit in women. And I actually have currently a team where all of the PhD students are women. And I'm actually very glad, and some of them do spectacularly well. But you need to be able to learn how to recognize that, and this is not something that's talked about. I think one advice I would give people is fundamentally you're hiring a colleague, right? You're hiring someone who's going to come into your team, sort of as a sort of an intern at first, and you're trying to bring that person up to become a junior colleague. So obviously you're going to spend a lot of time with this person, and obviously things that you don't think about, like communication and intellectual empathy, are going to be important. And these are not things that you can tease out of a 30-minute video chat, right? Because people can act. And so the way I do it is I invite the candidates to visit my group for an entire week. I embed them in my group. We take meals together. We take coffees together. They join discussions and so on. And certainly that process is not perfect, but it gives you a sense of, okay, who this person is, how do they think? But of course, it doesn't give you insights into really important things like how do they respond to diversity? Are they resilient? And so on. And at the end of the day, you are taking a bet, right? You're betting on the promise of human beings, and you're extrapolating. And people need to recognize that this is a learning process, right? It's not a mechanistic, deterministic process.
My supervisor's advice to me is look for the work ethics over how smart they are. So I feel like you're saying nearly the same thing. It's really how well they do in certain circumstances, and not just how great they are in paper.
Can I say like it's a bit like for lack of a better term, it's a bit like a fire in the belly. but it manifests itself differently for women versus men. So one needs to be very careful about that.
Nicholas.
Yeah, I basically echo what Kevin and Hsiang already said. I mean, yeah, it's a part of the a part of being a PI that is not often talked about. I completely agree with that, and it's something that I'm still learning also. So these inputs are also, valuable to me. And in terms of recruiting postdocs and PhDs, whether it's ERC under an ERC project or not, I think the basic requirements is kind of similar, right? So I always ask myself, is this a person who is willing enough? I mean, if I train him or her properly, is this someone who will actually become a proper independent researcher? Because that's all a PhD and postdoc training is actually meaning, right? So we are training them to be a proper independent researcher by the end of the project. So that's basically the one main question that I ask myself about when I'm interviewing candidates. Now, specifically with regard to ERC, I mean, the nice thing, I'm quite a practical person. So the nice thing about ERC is the amount of money, right? So there's a lot of flexibility in what you can actually do with that amount of money. So what I'm also looking for ERC applications is the ability to think out of the box, the ability to think that, if you're given this amount of money, what will they do with that? So what kind of creative ideas can they come up with? That's, in terms of the main difference between applicants for ERC projects and non-ERC projects, I think that's the main difference for me.
That's an advice I'll take. Ari.
Yeah, I mean, I think people on the panel have, have very eloquently spoken about all of this. These are good qualities. The only thing I would add is I have seen postdocs, only last week, my last PhD student who's just graduated got a position in a biotech company as head of pathology. So, but when he first turned up, right, so he's from Milan, and he turned up with a suit, and he had a cigarette in his hand. So you would never hire him, but he had something in it. I saw. But the thing, what I'm trying to say there is that people. So PhD programs for 4 years, and you're recruiting very young people. So 4 years in a young person's life is a long time, so people can develop and learn and develop and change their own character if you provide the environment where they can do that. And obviously, what Kevin is saying, you got to have those people who have the grit to follow through with stuff and not just give up as well. But also different people have different ways within the same lab to develop in different ways. So I had like 3 PhD students. One of them worked 16 hours a day. One of them only worked like 8 hours a day, right? But then I wasn't pushing the guy who was working 8 hours a day to go to 16 hours. I wasn't telling the 16-hour day guys to go to, I said, you just work differently by your output. What do you want to achieve? If you're achieving that, then it's fine. And the guy who worked 8 hours a day now works for Google Deep Learning because he developed an algorithm which we now is world class in our lab that's leading in that field. But he would come in at 10 o'clock and go home at 2, right? And other people in the lab would get upset with me. Why is this guy not in the lab? And I said, well, sometimes, every football team, you need a Cristiano Ronaldo, right? And he comes in, does his stuff, scores the goal, the whole team wins. Then they can see how different people have different roles and the team wins together. So the publication, everybody's on it and everybody get a chance. So it's about letting young people develop, and seeing their development is fantastically, for me, is job satisfaction for me as a PI, but also providing the environment and the different management skills for the different people. I mean, I'm sure Hsiang has similar thing that, and Kevin can say similar things as well as Nick, because there will be times when you will have conflict. What you want is not necessarily what they want.
Mhm.
But then you have to get them, because they are young, they may not necessarily have the experience to know that what you know and the pain you have to go through to get there. And as long as they trust you with their career to take you there, and I think people will take that through and give them time to develop. That's all, really.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Because Ari triggered some thoughts that I wanted to share, which is that very often our stereotype of like maybe an old Germanic professor is that usually a he, yeah, it's a fountain of wisdom and the wisdom flows one way, right? And consequently, what you see more often is that this professor makes poor copies of himself, right? So first he makes 4 copies of himself, the copies make poorer copies, and as you go down the pyramid, the fidelity of the copy diminishes. But I had a different philosophy when I hired. I was taking advice from several people about leadership. I was reading about people. And one of the qualities that I realized that people told me was never be afraid to admit that you have gaps in your skill set or knowledge to your subordinates. And in fact, that then inspired me to hire postdocs who have skill sets that I don't. That makes it much more interesting, because then on one hand, I'm very open with saying like, I'm hiring you because you have this skill set, I think, and I don't, and I have this to offer you, and we can learn from each other. And in fact, I have learned a lot from just postdocs coming to my group. I adapt slightly my interest to their interest. Of course, it shouldn't be that they are, this is a biologist working on something that I don't know nothing about, right? So broadly, they're in the same field. But in the details, this is how I hire my postdocs. I tend to hire them so that they are extremely different. Like when we had the 7 postdocs, they were very different. They all had a different core expertise. And when we gathered, it was more like a gathering of minds rather than a assembly of a pyramid. The other thing that Ari's description triggered is I wanted to tell you about a student I had from years ago, 5-6 years ago. He applied from Taiwan. So it was, okay, I will not say any names so I don't get any heat for this. It was an unremarkable university. He had unremarkable grades. The letters were unremarkable from completely unknown people. But he wrote a paper, and I read the paper and I thought, wow, this is great. If he really wrote this paper, I want this guy, right? So I read the paper 3 times and I thought, okay, I'm gonna fly him out. So on a whim, I flew him out all the way from Taiwan, Switzerland. I made him give a talk in front of me and 2 postdocs. And he gave the talk, and I realized, okay, he really did write this paper. And B, the way he thinks clearly surpasses that of a master's student, right? He's thinking like a 3rd, 4th year PhD student. I can see that. It doesn't translate the paper, but I can see that. And 4 years later, fast forward, at that time, at least, he was the best student who came out from my group. He won 2 PhD prizes. He got multiple offers. He's now at Oxford actually on someone else's ERC advanced grant on a long-term contract. And when he started, and the other thing to tell you is when he started, I said, I would like to work on atmospheric chemistry together. And then his response to me was, I don't know anything about chemistry. And then my response, which shocked him, was, me neither. So the 4 of us started learning chemistry completely from scratch, the 2 of us, sorry. And over the 4 years of his PhD, he built himself into one of the leading experts in atmospheric chemical kinetics in exoplanet science. So it's again one of these things where I think the intangibles are much more important than the tangibles, and you're investing in people, right? You have to look beyond the grades. You have to look beyond what is written on paper. And conversely, I will not give you examples. I will not tell you names, but I've had students who really look great on paper from very famous schools. I've had students from Cambridge, Oxford, ETH pass through my group. And I've had students from ETH who look really nice on paper. And it didn't turn out well because one of these qualities I described to you was absent, like grit or resilience or determination. So I have a very different perspective on this. But yeah, that's all I would say.
I think I'll close there. It's been such a great privilege having all of you share your experience, and I think it's interesting, of course, because I'm a social scientist and all of you are in the sciences. And so to me, it's also a very fascinating perspective in terms of how you do things, how you've done things with your ERC. And I'm sure I myself for sure have learned a lot from this conversation, but also I think people who are thinking about moving to Europe, applying for ERC, people who are applying for ERC postdocs, I think that's something we have, I think, contributed for the Southeast Asians who want to make the big move from Asia to here to us.